April 1967, Laos, Vietnam borderlands were drowning in humidity and silence. The kind of silence that never meant peace. It meant waiting. Captain Daniel Mercer of the U.S. Army Aviation stood on a temporary landing strip carved out of jungle and red clay, staring at something he never expected to see intact, let alone breathing. The rotors were still slowly ticking to a stop, creaking like an old ship at anchor. A Soviet-built Mi-4. It squatted on its landing gear like a prehistoric insect, bulbous nose forward, cockpit windows thick and flat, fuselage wide enough to swallow a truck. It looked nothing like the sleek Bell UH-1 Hueys Mercer had flown since arriving in Southeast Asia, where the Huey was angular and nervous. The Mi-4 was blunt, heavy, unapologetic. And it was whole. The helicopter had been captured 3 hours earlier, forced down after an engine fire during a night resupply run supporting North Vietnamese forces along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Its crew, 2 Soviet-trained Vietnamese pilots and a flight engineer, had abandoned it after setting demolition charges that never detonated. Whether by moisture, faulty wiring, or rushed hands, the charges failed. Now the Americans had it. Officially, it did not exist. Within 40 minutes, the perimeter was sealed. No cameras, no radio chatter, no markings. The aircraft was immediately reclassified under a black project designation Mercer had never heard before. By dawn, it would be dismantled, loaded onto transport aircraft in pieces, and disappear into a hangar halfway across the Pacific. Mercer had been summoned because of one line in his file: extensive rotary wing test background, calm under unfamiliar conditions. He walked slowly around the Mi-4, boots sinking into the mud. The helicopter smelled different from American machines. Not just fuel and oil, but something cruder: industrial grease, scorched insulation, damp canvas. The metal skin was thick, uneven in places. Rivets stood proud instead of flush. It looked overbuilt, like a flying tractor. "Looks like it belongs on a farm," one sergeant muttered. Mercer said nothing. He climbed the side ladder and leaned into the cockpit. The glass was thick, nearly armored. Instrument labels were in Cyrillic, hand-painted, uneven. The controls were massive, designed for gloved hands, not finesse. No comfort, no padding, no unnecessary electronics. This was not a pilot's helicopter. It was a logistics animal. The briefing came at dusk in a canvas tent lit by a single bulb. A colonel from Army Intelligence spoke without ceremony. "Gentlemen, what you saw today is a Mi-4, NATO reporting name, Hound. Soviet medium transport helicopter. Designed early 1950s. Payload, roughly 1,600 kilograms internally. Can carry troops, artillery, supplies, or wounded. Range limited. Speed unimpressive, but rugged." He paused. "North Vietnamese use it sparingly. Mostly at night. Mostly for missions Hueys aren't built for. Short field resupply, rough terrain insertion, hauling loads that would break our birds." Mercer felt a tightening in his chest. The colonel continued. "We believe this aircraft represents a different operational philosophy, one that we don't fully understand. You're here to help us understand it." That night, Mercer couldn't sleep. Rain hammered the tent roof. He replayed the day in his head. He thought of Hueys scattered across Vietnam, their thin skins torn apart by ground fire, their complex systems demanding constant maintenance. He loved the Huey. It was responsive, agile, a pilot's machine, but it was also fragile. The Mi-4 looked like it expected to be shot at. 3 days later, Mercer was airborne over the Pacific, sitting beside the dismantled corpse of the helicopter, now reduced to labeled crates. The destination was never spoken aloud. Only a code name: Project Iron Lantern. 2 weeks after that, he stood in a secure hangar at Edwards Air Force Base. The Mi-4 had been reassembled with methodical care by engineers who spoke in whispers. No flags, no insignia, just a gray machine under harsh lights. Mercer ran his hand along the fuselage. The metal was cold and thick. An engineer shook his head. "This thing violates every weight optimization principle we use." Mercer replied quietly, "Maybe that's the point." The translated flight manual arrived the next morning. It was shockingly thin. No flowcharts. No emergency trees branching into sub-procedures. Just fundamentals. Start, lift, carry, land. No redundancies for comfort. Only for survival. When Mercer finally climbed into the left seat, the cockpit felt like a truck cab. The engine start sequence was violent. The Shvetsov radio roared to life like an angry animal, shaking the entire airframe. Instruments rattled. The helicopter felt barely contained. Jesus, Mercer muttered. This thing doesn't want permission. The first hover was ugly. Heavy. Sluggish. The controls responded slowly, but with authority. Every input felt like steering mass, not balance. Once airborne, the Mi-4 settled into flight with a steadiness that surprised him. It didn't dance. It marched. At altitude, Mercer tested climbs, turns, simulated load conditions. The helicopter didn't care. With weight slung underneath, it simply accepted it. No complaints. No finesse. Just lift. He began to understand. The Huey was built for pilots. The Mi-4 was built for war. As he brought it back toward the runway, Mercer realized something unsettling. This helicopter wasn't designed to win dogfights, evade fire, or impress evaluators. It was designed to keep flying when everything else stopped. And that scared him more than any MiG ever had. The second flight came with ballast. Steel drums filled with concrete were bolted into the cargo bay, chained to the floor using fittings that looked like they had been borrowed from a shipyard. The engineers wanted to simulate battlefield reality. Ammunition crates, artillery shells, wounded men on stretchers, fuel barrels leaking fumes. Mercer watched them work, impressed despite himself. The Mi-4's cargo bay was cavernous compared to the Huey's narrow interior. Where the Huey forced compromise, weight versus fuel, men versus altitude, the Mi-4 assumed excess. It was built around the idea that war never went according to plan. The takeoff roll was longer. The radial engine bellowed, rotors biting the air with slow, deliberate authority. For a moment, Mercer thought it wouldn't lift at all. Then it did. Not gracefully, not eagerly, but undeniably. The helicopter clawed upward like a laborer hauling a load, each meter earned through torque and stubbornness. Once airborne, it stabilized, carrying its burden without drama. The controls were heavy, almost agricultural, but predictable. Mercer could feel the machine thinking in terms of effort, not elegance. In the air, the contrast with the UH-1 became painfully clear. The Huey was reactive. It demanded constant attention, constant trimming, constant correction. It was alive, nervous, brilliant, but it exhausted its pilots. The Mi-4 was the opposite. Once set on a heading, it stayed there. It didn't invite improvisation. It tolerated mistakes. One of the test engineers spoke over the intercom. Feels like it doesn't care who's flying it. Mercer nodded. Exactly. That was the moment the philosophy clicked. American helicopters were designed around the assumption of skilled pilots, advanced training, and controlled operating environments. Soviet helicopters assumed fatigue, poor weather, rough fields, and crews who might be barely competent. The Mi-4 wasn't forgiving because it was kind. It was forgiving because it expected failure. During simulated engine-out drills, Mercer was startled again. The helicopter descended heavily, but controllably. No sudden drop. No dramatic loss of authority. It wanted to survive, even when wounded. After landing, the maintenance crews swarmed it. What took hours on a Huey took minutes here. Panels open wide. Components were accessible. There was room for hands, tools, improvisation. Nothing was buried behind layers of electronics or tight tolerances. One mechanic laughed. You could fix this thing drunk. Mercer didn't laugh back. In the briefing room that evening, Mercer presented his preliminary findings. Charts showed speed, climb rate, fuel consumption. On paper, the Mi-4 lost almost every comparison. Slower, heavier, less agile. Then he spoke without slides. This helicopter is not meant to fight, he said. It's meant to endure. A colonel frowned. Captain, endurance doesn't win wars. Mercer met his eyes. Logistics does, sir. Silence followed. Mercer continued. In Vietnam, we rely on air mobility to compensate for terrain. But our helicopters are optimized for performance, not punishment. The Mi-4 assumes punishment is guaranteed. He described scenarios intelligence had pieced together. Mi-4's landing on crude clearings at night, hauling artillery pieces that Hueys couldn't lift, flying despite damage that would ground American aircraft. He described crews trained not for mastery, but for repetition. Quantity of effort over quality of execution. After the briefing, an Air Force officer pulled Mercer aside. You're suggesting their weakness is intentional. Mercer replied, I'm suggesting it's misidentified. Weeks passed. Mercer flew the Mi-4 repeatedly. Night flights, hot and high simulations, emergency landings on dirt and gravel. Each time, the helicopter revealed the same truth. It was not designed to be loved. It was designed to be used. Intelligence reports from Southeast Asia began aligning with his observations. North Vietnamese logistics routes, once thought limited, were more resilient than expected. Supplies appeared where they shouldn't. Units reconstituted faster than predicted. The Mi-4 was part of that puzzle. In one classified session, Mercer was shown aerial reconnaissance footage. Grainy infrared images of helicopters landing briefly in jungle clearings, unloading heavy crates, lifting again before American aircraft could respond. These aren't Huey-style operations, the analyst said. They're brute force insertions. Mercer leaned forward. Because brute force doesn't need perfection. The project report grew longer, darker in tone. Mercer stopped comparing the Mi-4 to American helicopters directly. Instead, he wrote about systems. American aviation was a chain. Break one link, and the system failed. The Soviet system was a net. Tear part of it, and the rest still held. That difference, he argued, mattered more than speed or elegance. When his report reached higher command, the response was muted. No praise, no condemnation, just quiet filing under restricted access. One general wrote a margin note. Interesting, but not applicable to U.S. doctrine. Mercer read that line several times. He thought of Vietnam, of pilots flying 3, 4 missions a day, of maintenance crews stretched thin, of machines designed for ideal conditions forced into constant improvisation. He thought of the Mi-4, lumbering and ugly, lifting loads it had no business carrying, refusing to fail cleanly. Late one night, alone in the hangar, Mercer stood beneath its rotor disc. The machine loomed above him, silent now. You're not better, he said quietly. You're just honest. He knew then that the helicopter itself was not the threat. The threat was what it represented. A war designed not to be won quickly, but to be sustained indefinitely. And America, for all its brilliance, was not built for that kind of fight. By late 1968, Project Iron Lantern was quietly winding down. The Mi-4 had yielded all the data it was ever going to give. Performance charts were complete. Maintenance timelines documented. Failure modes categorized. The helicopter itself sat idle in the hangar, paint dulled, its presence tolerated but never embraced. It was an uncomfortable artifact. Captain Daniel Mercer was summoned to Washington for a final debrief. Not a ceremony, not a presentation, a conversation. The room was small, windowless. 2 generals, 1 civilian analyst. A tape recorder placed deliberately in the center of the table. Captain, one general began. Your technical conclusions are clear. The Mi-4 is inferior by most measurable standards. Yet your assessments suggest we should be concerned. Mercer chose his words carefully. Sir, I'm not concerned about the helicopter. I'm concerned about the assumptions we make when we design ours. The civilian leaned forward. Explain. Mercer did. Slowly, methodically. He spoke about American doctrine, how every aircraft assumed air superiority, intact infrastructure, reliable logistics, and highly trained crews. How complexity was justified by capability. How elegance was mistaken for inevitability. Then he spoke about the Mi-4. How it assumes damage, he said. How it assumes exhaustion. How it assumes the pilot is replaceable, the machine expendable, and the mission non-negotiable. He paused. That's not incompetence. That's preparation. One of the generals frowned. We don't fight wars like that. Mercer met his gaze. Sir, in Vietnam we are. The recorder clicked softly. The meeting ended without resolution. Officially, the Mi-4 evaluation concluded that Soviet rotary wing technology lagged behind Western standards. Unofficially, Mercer's philosophical appendix circulated quietly among a handful of doctrine writers and engineers. Most ignored it. Some did not. In the years that followed, Mercer returned to Southeast Asia, not as a test pilot, but as an advisor. He watched Hueys fly themselves to exhaustion. He watched crews cannibalize damaged aircraft to keep others airborne. He watched missions canceled not because they were impossible, but because the machines were too fragile to risk again. He also watched intelligence footage of enemy supply routes that refused to die. The Mi-4s were rarely seen. When they appeared, it was brief, inelegant, effective. They did not win battles. They prevented defeat. In 1971, Mercer was asked to review early design concepts for a new American utility helicopter. One proposal emphasized speed, avionics integration, crew comfort. Another emphasized armor, redundancy, maintainability. Mercer wrote only one sentence in the margin: assume everything will go wrong. Years later, that philosophy would quietly echo in aircraft like the CH-47 Chinook and the UH-60 Black Hawk, machines less graceful than their predecessors, but far more durable. Helicopters designed to fly wounded, to land rough, to be fixed by tired men in bad conditions. No one credited the Mi-4. No one mentioned Iron Lantern. By the time the Vietnam War ended, the captured helicopter was no longer useful. It was transferred to storage, stripped of sensitive modifications, its paperwork buried under layers of classification. Mercer retired shortly after. In 1983, he visited a military aviation museum in the American Southwest. Rows of polished aircraft gleamed under bright lights. Fighters, bombers, helicopters restored to a perfection they had never known in service. In the corner, half-lit and rarely visited, stood a large, ungainly Soviet helicopter. Mi-4. Its paint was chipped. Its tires cracked. Its cockpit looked archaic even by Cold War standards. A placard beneath it read, "Captured enemy transport helicopter. Limited historical significance." Mercer stood there for a long time. A young man nearby, perhaps a student pilot, glanced at the Mi-4 and scoffed. Ugly thing. Must have been terrible to fly. Mercer smiled faintly. Terrible, he agreed. If you wanted comfort. The student shrugged and walked away. Mercer rested a hand against the fuselage. The metal was thick, cold, honest. He remembered the first hover, the weight, the refusal to fail quickly. He remembered realizing that the helicopter didn't care about excellence, only continuation. That was the lesson no chart could capture. Wars, Mercer had learned, were not decided by the best machines. They were decided by the machines that kept working after brilliance collapsed under fatigue. The Mi-4 was not a symbol of Soviet superiority. It was a symbol of Soviet expectation. Expectation of loss, of damage, of chaos, and preparation for all of it. As Mercer left the museum, he thought of something an old maintenance chief in Vietnam had once told him, kneeling beside a broken Huey in the rain. "Sir, the best aircraft ain't the one that flies perfect. It's the one that still flies when it shouldn't." The Mi-4 had understood that from the beginning. It never tried to be better than its enemy. It only tried to last longer. And in wars of endurance, Mercer knew that was often enough.